Class 6. Chapter 24. Reading Comprehension. 1. Read the passage and then answer the questions that follow. Once we parked, we leapt from the car and lay pressed up against the concrete wall of the overpass. Before I could count to 20, a roar surrounded us. It sounded like a freight train passing overhead. Then, suddenly, it was over. We had made it. That Saturday when Maria and I had chosen a route for our 5-mile bike ride seemed perfect. We set out at 7 a.m. in beautiful spring weather. The sun shone brightly. Birds sang on the trees along the roadside. At 10:30 a.m. when we stopped for a break, we both felt terrific. As we rested, though, a brisk wind sprang up. That was when our perfect day began to change. By noon, we knew a serious thunderstorm was blowing our way. A towering bank of dark clouds had rolled up out of the southwest. A stinging wind burned our faces. There was no way to stay out of the storm. We would have to wait it out, but where? Then things went from bad to worse. The temperature dropped suddenly. I looked up and saw that the sky now had a dark greenish cast. Trees and crops were bent over by the wind. No animals were in sight. Then a blue car pulled alongside our bikes. The lady said, "Get in." She looked frightened, and we must have, too. We did as she said. That was when the hail started. Chunks of ice, the size of golf balls, pounded the windshield and dented the hood. She sped northwards with a determined look on her face. Could she outrun that storm? Maria and I looked back at the black sky. That's when we saw it. Maria screamed. I yelled, "Tornado!" It was so close that I could see tree limbs, doors and all sorts of other stuff that the monster had swallowed. My heart had moved up to my throat and was beating so hard I thought it would leap from my body. I had never been so terrified. We would never outrun the tornado. The lady turned to us and said calmly, "We'll get through this. There's an overpass ahead. We'll pull in there for protection." Once we parked, we leapt from the car and lay pressed up against the concrete wall of the overpass. Before I could count to 20, a roar surrounded us. It sounded like a freight train passing overhead. Then, suddenly, it was over. We had made it. Some trees were uprooted. Tree branches and flowers were scattered all over. Yet everything was calm and quiet. We got to a phone and called home. Our parents had been terribly worried. But, soon we were all laughing with relief. We were shaken but excited. What a story I would get to tell at school. 2. Read the passage and then answer the questions that follow. Did you see that? Joe said to his friend Bob. You're a great shooter. Bob caught the basketball and bounced it before throwing it again. The ball flew into the net. Bob, you never miss. Joe said admiringly. Unless I'm in a real game, Bob complained. Then I miss all the time. Joe knew that Bob was right. Bob performed much better when he was having fun with Joe in the schoolyard than he did when he was playing for the school team in front of a large crowd. Maybe you just need to practice more, Joe suggested. But I practice all the time with you. Bob objected. He shook his head. I just can't play well when people are watching me. You play well when I'm watching, Joe pointed out. That's because I've known you since we were 5 years old, Bob said with a smile. I'm just not comfortable playing when other people are around. Joe nodded and understood, but he also had an idea. The next day Joe and Bob met in the schoolyard again to practice. A few minutes, Joe excused himself. "Practice without me," Joe said to his friend. "I'll be back in a minute." Joe hurried through the school building, gathering together whomever he could find, two students, a maths teacher, two secretaries, and a janitor. When Joe explained why he needed them, everyone was happy to help. Joe reminded the group to stay quiet as they all went towards the school's basketball court. As Joe had hoped, Bob was still practicing basketball. He made 5 baskets in a row without noticing the silent people standing behind him. "Hey, Bob!" Joe called out finally. Bob turned. A look of surprise came over his face. "I just wanted to show you that you could play well with people watching you," Joe said. "Now you'll have nothing to worry about for the next game." 3. Read the given passage and then answer the questions that follow. The Poetry Express jazzy new signs in subway stations have been catching the eyes of commuters in Washington, D.C. Instead of rushing to board a train, people pause to read poems written by kids. The lighted posters, called Metro Muse, appeared at 10 train stops in the busy city. On display, 12 thoughtful compositions to celebrate kids' creativity and to promote reading. Writer Laurie Stroblas began the District Lines Poetry Project in 1994, hoping to give bus riders something better to stare at than ads or graffiti. She had been leading poetry workshops in public schools, so she asked her students to lend a helping hand. The response was incredible, says Stroblas. Later, she decided to transfer her ideas to the buses and picked new poems with the advice of 150 students. Organizations donated enough money to keep Metro Muse in subway stations all through winter. In spring, a new set of poems sprouted in city buses. What were the poems about? Snow falling, the arrival of a new year, love, fear and peace. Cindy Rosales, a 6th grader at Auster Elementary School, was inspired by her favorite type of music, kindness is jazz, she wrote. Bring the big jazz in. The big, whole jazz. Like most poets, the children had mixed feelings about letting the public read their private thoughts. "I would feel glad that someone read my poem," one girl said. "But I would feel sad if they missed their train." The response was incredible, says Stroblas. Later, she decided to transfer her ideas to the buses and picked new poems with the advice of 150 students. Organizations donated enough money to keep Metro Muse in subway stations all through winter. In spring, a new set of poems sprouted in city buses. What were the poems about? Snow falling, the arrival of a new year, love, fear and peace. Cindy Rosales, a 6th grader at Auster Elementary School, was inspired by her favorite type of music, kindness is jazz, she wrote. Bring the big jazz in. The big, whole jazz. Like most poets, the children had mixed feelings about letting the public read their private thoughts. "I would feel glad that someone read my poem," one girl said. "But I would feel sad if they missed their train."